Good afternoon, everybody. We'll let everybody get settled and we'll get started right on time today. I want to welcome and thank you all for coming here today to the Urban Institute, to the headquarters, or joining us online for this timely and important discussion titled Policies to Expand Equity-Oriented Affordable Housing, Opportunities and Cautions from Recent Research. I'm Yannicka Ratcliffe. I'm Vice President of the Housing Finance Policy Center here at Urban, as well as Acting Vice President for the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center. That is a mouthful, but it reflects how we at Urban are deeply rooted in understanding the connections between community development, housing, and housing finance, and the implications for policies across these areas that can advance broader well-being of people and communities. Our host and organizer is Policies for Action, or P4A, a signature research program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, administered by the National Coordinating Center here at Urban. P4A funds research, identifying policies, laws, and other public and private sector levers that can support Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's vision to build a culture of health and help achieve health and racial equity. P4A is helping to explore the root causes of health disparities in America and identify potential solutions to improve health, equity, and well-being. So thank you to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for funding this important work and for placing this program here, aligning with Urban's commitment and capacity to examine evidence and inform policy that truly moves the needle for communities and our nation as a whole. Today, we will first hear about a subset of P4A-funded research, followed by discussion of housing policies that seek to expand access to affordable housing and to address a legacy of discrimination and systemic inequity. Then we will hear perspectives from the real world, from policymakers and community advocates who can speak to the application and outcomes of specific policies and how research could in turn further inform their work. We also look forward to hearing from you here in the room and online. Your interest, knowledge, and experience enriches these conversations immensely. But first, I have a few housekeeping reminders, and then I will introduce a very special guest to start today's program off on the right foot with his usual insight. So in terms of housekeeping, just some reminders. This is a hybrid event. We are recording, and we will share the recording after the event so you can review it and share it yourselves. For the virtual attendees, live captions are on and adjustable at the bottom of your media player. Virtual members can type questions into the Q&A box at any time during the program, and if you're here in the room, you can use the QR code scanner at your table to submit questions. We also encourage engaging with us online at #LiveAtUrban, and there will be a survey at the end of the event that we hope you will fill so that we can continue to improve our events. And then finally, audience members in the room, just a reminder to mute your phones. So with that, I have the distinct privilege of introducing our special guest, who has quite a history in the housing space. Solomon Green once served as Senior Fellow in the Research to Action Lab and the Metropolitan Housing and Community Policy Center here at Urban. Immediately before joining Urban, he was a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, where he helped develop federal policies to reduce segregation and expand neighborhood choice. He was also HUD's principal advisor on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So he left HUD to be with us as a senior fellow, and then he left us to go back to HUD, where he currently serves as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research. And now, we're very excited to welcome him back for today's event. Please join me in welcoming Solomon Green.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Yannicka. I also want to thank Lisa Dubé, Laudia Aaron, and the Policies for Action Research Hub team, and all the P4A scholars that you'll hear from during the panels this afternoon. And also want to thank Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for your support for Policies for Action, and for bringing us together this afternoon. As Yannicka mentioned, my name is Solomon Green, and if she thought it was, the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center was a mouthful, try my title at HUD on for size. I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And usually by the time I finish my title, my time is up. But really honored. The short way of saying that is I have the honor and privilege to be able to lead a team of over 200 economists and social scientists and data scientists and innovators and capacity builders who all share a commitment to advancing HUD's mission using the best available data, evidence, and community-driven insights. So as Yannicka mentioned, this is a bit of a homecoming for me, coming back to the Urban Institute, where for about 8 years, my research focused on affordable housing and land use, inclusive and equitable development in cities. I was also once, I guess, a P4A scholar supported by the Policies for Action program, along with my colleague Martha Galvez, leading a project conducting research on discrimination against housing choice voucher holders and the effectiveness of state and local laws and policies that ban discrimination, often referred against voucher holders, often referred to as source of income discrimination. And lest you think that P4A is not influencing policy, the suite of research projects that we developed with that support, I use every day at HUD. We developed a data set of state and local laws banning source of income discrimination and their characteristics that's now available on HUD's website as an interactive map. And the case studies that we did of state and local laws informs our work on improving the voucher program every day. But most importantly for me, it's really a homecoming today in terms of the themes of the day and a career-spanning commitment to fair, equitable, and affordable housing and community development. I've held a fundamental and lifelong commitment to the idea that where you grow up should not determine who you can become later in life. And for that commitment leads me to a different kind of homecoming that stretches even further back. And that is my own experience growing up in poverty in rural New York, raised by a single mom who, while working full-time as a registered nurse, didn't make enough to cover the rent and make ends meet. So we received public assistance in the form of Medicaid and food stamps. Moved around, I counted 9 times I moved before I was 10 years old, often due to rent increases. She managed to scrimp and save just enough for a down payment on a house where she still lives today with my brother, sister-in-law, and baby nephew. And I share that story because I know it's part of my commitment both to housing and this idea of investing in places. I know that if she hadn't had the opportunity to buy that house, I wouldn't have been able to focus on my studies. We all know, we have a lot of researchers in the room, how housing instability can affect educational outcomes. I wouldn't have been able to eventually go to college and then grad school and become that Urban Institute scholar and now lead HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. As importantly, I know that the area we grew up in, which at the time was a high poverty area in rural New York, is now very gentrified, if that term can be expanded to include rural areas, very expensive, rife with economic opportunities, robust healthcare, and high quality schools. And if she had not had an opportunity to buy that house, my brother, his wife, my baby nephew, certainly wouldn't be able to afford to still live there today. So I know the effect that housing and equitable housing policies can have on people and children and communities. So while this commitment to disentangling zip code from destiny has been steadfast, my thinking has evolved about what the barriers are to realizing this goal for a long career. And I've come to realize that often progress in this area has been stifled by dichotomous thinking and entrenched ideologies, especially among researchers, policymakers, and advocates, but notably not among the people who are the subject of the research or affected by those policy decisions. I saw early warning signs of this in my career. I started my career in working on affordable housing development, but I also studied land use law with a strong emphasis on fair housing and exclusionary zoning. And I constantly saw infighting in the field among those who based their career and their approach to building deeply affordable housing wherever they could afford to do so, and those who argued that the only solution to ending poverty was to relocate people out of high poverty areas. More generally, we could describe this as debates between those who were committed to fixing broken places, those who argued they weren't broken, and those who argued they were unfixable. I think this led to a commitment later in my career to bridging these divides, and had an opportunity when I was working at the Open Society Foundations through grant making, through our convening, to really bring together fair housing, affordable housing, community development advocates to really work together, because I think we're often trying to achieve the same goals, but because of the way we approach the solutions and the challenges, we don't always work together. That work continued the first time I went to HUD and had the opportunity to work on the first version of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which embraced what we might call today a both and or balanced approach to fair housing that included comprehensive revitalization strategies. This all really hit home right after I started at the Urban Institute in very late 2014. I was working with Marge Turner, who many of you may know, and we had read an article, an op-ed in the New York Times by Thomas Edsall, that was called "Where Should Poor People Live?" And I'll come back to that title later in my talk. But Thomas Edsall in this article, or this op-ed, asked the question, if the policy goal is to help families move up the ladder, where should a poor family live? Should federal dollars go towards affordable housing within high poverty neighborhoods, or should subsidies be used to move residents of impoverished communities into more upscale and more resistant sections of cities and suburbs with better schools and job opportunities? Marge and I wrote, co-author what was my very first blog post. You have to realize this is 2015. I was not used to short form or digital publications at the time. And it was called "Disarming the Great Affordable Housing Debate." And I'll say more about that title. But Edsall came squarely down on using subsidies to move residents out of impoverished communities into more upscale sections of cities and suburbs. And he laid the blame on a poverty housing industry that he said conspires to keep poor families trapped in poverty by building affordable housing in distressed areas isolated from economic opportunities. In our blog post, Marge and I pushed back. We argued that Edsall was setting up a false dichotomy between meeting residents' needs where they are through comprehensive community revitalization strategies and relocating them to higher opportunity areas. And we suggested, rather than focusing on dichotomous, and I would argue divisive solutions, we need a range of strategies tailored to local conditions and context in order to overcome persistent patterns of racial segregation and concentrated poverty. This ended up being a major theme of my research during the more than 7 years that followed at the Urban Institute, challenging dichotomous thinking and identifying what those range of strategies are and how to tailor them to local conditions and contexts. Our thinking, in this case, Marge and I wrote a lot of papers together after this, evolved to include not just concentrated poverty and racial segregation as the culprits of unequal landscapes of opportunity, but also vicious cycles of disinvestment and reinvestment driven by urban redevelopment strategies that value capital accumulation over people and communities, often associated with gentrification and displacement, particularly in Black and brown communities. So we came to realize there's no single cause of the inequitable housing patterns and outcomes we see today. So it makes sense there's also no silver bullet solution. Marge had long had a term for this, which she called place-conscious strategies. I fumble because I never really agreed with her on the term and always argued for opportunity neighborhoods to encourage people to think differently and beyond the status quo about what's possible and what's necessary. We ended up writing a paper called Opportunity Neighborhoods that asked a different kind of question than Edsall's. We asked, what would it take to ensure that every family, regardless of race, income, or region, could live in a safe, healthy, stable, and affordable home that in a neighborhood that meets their needs and serves as a springboard for economic opportunity. We had identified not only a set of evidence-based strategies that we believed, and I still believe, could achieve that goal, but a set of metrics to measure progress along the way. Now, I'm not going to go into those strategies or those metrics. We don't have time for that. You're welcome to read the paper. I believe it's still available on the Urban Institute website. But whenever we shared the paper, one of the greatest challenges we face was people who were committed to scour it for a detailed treatment of their pet problem. It's gentrification, damn it, and criticize us for not giving it enough attention or not doubling down on a single set of solutions associated with it, just cause eviction protections and community land ownership. Great solutions, by the way, I'm not criticizing them. The point is that putting out this portfolio and range of strategies somehow triggered people into doubling down on their own set of solutions and feeling some set of discomfort with a more comprehensive approach. And there it was, dichotomous thinking all over again. So I would argue that to break the cycle of dichotomous thinking that is holding us back from more comprehensive and systemic solutions, we first need to know and understand our history. The P4A team asked me to spend some time today providing us with some background on the housing policies that got us here today. And then they said I had 15 minutes. So I won't go into a lot of detail. Many of the people in this room know that history quite well, and I'm sure some of the scholars who will be hearing from us later will describe it in more detail. But let me suggest at the outset that there was no single policy that created unequal, inequitable, and unjust patterns of affordable housing and access to opportunity that we see today. Rather, there were multiple policies, even within a single challenge. So let's just take segregation as an example. We have racial, early in the 20th century, legalized racial zoning, blockbusting and steering, restrictive covenants, affordable housing siting, and then later in the 20th century through today, exclusionary zoning practices. So we could do that through all the problem sets. Disinvestment, we look back at credit redlining, subprime lending, and predatory lending, foreclosures, appraisal bias. So the list goes on and on. And once we begin to study and understand that history, it becomes clear why a range of equitable housing policies are needed to both address structural inequalities and tailor them to local contexts and conditions. After all, if no single policy caused the inequitable patterns that we see today, why should we expect a single policy solution? Rather, as Marge and I have argued over the years and in different papers, we need a portfolio of policies simultaneously. We need policies aimed at eliminating discrimination and reversing the lasting effects of past segregation and the ongoing harms of current segregation. We need policies aimed at reinvesting in disinvested communities, including investments in housing quality improvements, but also in all the things it takes to set families up for success and protect their health and well-being. And we need policies that prevent displacement and wealth loss in neighborhoods that are experiencing revitalization, including through affordable housing preservation, tenant and homeownership protections, inclusionary housing policies, and other equitable development strategies. The P4A team also asked me to say a bit about the federal government's role. And I have to say, one of the things I am most proud of about working for HUD in the Biden-Harris administration is how our approach both recognizes this history and operationalizes that commitment to comprehensive portfolio approaches. Only 6 days after taking office, President Biden issued a presidential memorandum on redressing our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies, where all of those practices and policies that I didn't have time to mention earlier are described in detail, and the administration makes a commitment to doing better in redressing the harms of those past policies. This memorandum, if you read it carefully, is an exercise in place-conscious and equitable affordable housing policies, and it is that framework that Marge and I had developed over the years put into practice. Now, I don't have time to say all of the progress, as much as I'd love to, all the progress we're making on all of those fronts, both within the administration at HUD, but I want to just say, just give you a flavor. So in terms of fighting discrimination and improving housing mobility, we've recently issued guidance on rooting out discrimination in tenant screening and online advertising, especially when owners and housing providers are using AI and algorithms, a big issue of our day. We also have done almost everything, I think, in our power, though somebody will say otherwise, to improve the housing choice voucher program in terms of the options that are available to those fortunate enough to receive a voucher, including through improving the way we calculate fair market rents, to expanding small area fair market rents, and creating resources for local communities to enforce the source of income discrimination laws that I mentioned earlier. We also are reinvesting in communities and helping them build wealth through programs like our Choice Neighborhoods program, and expanding fair access to home ownership. One of the things I'm very proud of is the work we've done through the PAVE task force to eradicate appraisal bias in the housing industry. And we recently issued a new FHA requirement that allows lenders allows borrowers to request a reassessment if they believe their appraisal was biased. We're also working on preventing displacement and wealth loss, and many of you may have seen the blueprint for a renter's bill of rights that was released last year. Lays out a set of principles to protect tenants and encourage rental affordability. HUD made 11 commitments in that blueprint. We've executed on all of them. And we've done similar protections in the homeownership space. The last thing I want to say that we've been working on, which I think is an important part of the equitable housing policy conversation, is working to address the fundamental shortage of affordable housing. And we have been doing this under the Biden-Harris Housing Supply Action Plan framework, which has the bold and ambitious but important goal of closing the housing supply gap in 5 years. We can't talk about equitable housing policies without also talking about the root cause of crushing cost burdens for many hardworking families, which is the fundamental supply shortage. I see Vicki Bean in the room. Her and her colleagues have written quite a bit about this, but I do believe that housing supply is an important root cause of everything we'll be talking about for the rest of the day, but that doesn't mean we can't nuance that conversation by talking as well about how to expand supply while also meeting the needs of low-income and very low-income families, and avoiding the mistakes of the past in terms of reconcentration of poverty and segregation. So all this is to say is that at HUD and in this administration, we are pursuing an equitable housing approach to housing policy, and it's an honor and a privilege to be able to put into practice so much of what I've been writing about and studying and researching and learning from you all here in the room over the past several years. So I'll just, is that my time? Oh, well, the last thing I was asked to talk about, which I'll close out on, is the role of research and evidence. And I think a lot of this may be implied in everything I've said so far, but let me put a finer point on it. I think I mentioned the importance of knowing our history. I also think it's incredibly important to demonstrate what works, to chart a path forward. And an example of this at HUD is the Federal Housing Administration began using positive rental history in our underwriting of FHA-insured loans. This really was inspired by research in the field demonstrating that positive rental history can expand the credit box for everyone while not creating more risk in the FHA portfolio. So we are piloting a positive rental history program in FHA, which allows FHA lenders to consider positive rental history in underwriting their mortgages. And we've been studying it as we go. And recent research conducted by my office shows that borrowers who have benefited from positive rental history are younger. They're more likely to be first-time homebuyers. They had lower credit scores, they had less wealth, and they were more likely to be Black or female. We estimated this policy will result in nearly 6,000 new mortgage originations a year. So I think this is a great example of a virtuous cycle of research, how we learn from, and the federal government and all government agencies and independent research, we test out new ideas, we monitor them as we go, and importantly, we assess what's working and what isn't. It's crucial in doing that to use disaggregated data, because often when we're looking at outcomes in the aggregate, it may obscure inequities in who's benefiting or who's being harmed by programs. So the last thing I want to say, and I think this is just very important, so I'll use one more minute to do it. I want to emphasize the need to center the perspectives, insights, and lived experience of people who face the greatest barriers to accessing safe, affordable, stable, and healthy housing in our research. Without doing this, research almost invariably is going to miss the mark, and policy solutions are going to fail to close equity gaps. And I think this starts with the research questions we're asking. So I want to go back to that title of Tom Edsel's op-ed that Marge and I wrote about. Where should the poor live? By asking the question this way, after asking the question this way, he turns to the growing body of research that suggests that stress and exposure to violence in high poverty neighborhoods can affect children's cognitive development, school performance, mental health, and long-term physical health. We know that research. It's incontrovertible and it is essential. But by the way he asks the question, I think it leads to misplaced blame and misplaced recommendations. By framing the policy question as where should poor people live, he turns people living in high poverty areas, all too often Black and brown people, into the object of policy, not the co-creators. Marge and I rebutted this at the time, although perhaps not forcefully enough. We wrote that poor families, like every other family, should live where they choose to live based on their family circumstances, needs, and aspirations. To move up the economic ladder, poor families, again, like all other families, would prefer to live in neighborhoods that are safe, they're healthy, they have good schools, they're located close to jobs and economic opportunities. These are the kind of neighborhoods that support upward mobility for families and especially kids. The reason that poor families often live in neighborhoods that lack these features has little to do with bad choices. Rather, it has everything to do with constrained choices. We could then shift the focus of blame away from bad choices on the part of residents living in concentrated poverty, compounded by a poverty housing industry, as Edsel alleged, to those structural forces, including government policies, that have systematically constrained choices for poor families, as well as Black and brown families, over the course of several decades and generations. I would argue when we center the lived experience and expertise of people who are most affected by policy decisions, it almost always takes us back to those root causes and interconnected structural solutions that have the potential to finally deliver on lasting, equitable housing and health outcomes that we're all here to talk about today. I look forward to being a partner with you all in that effort and learning alongside you today on how we can do better. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Yannicka, and thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Solomon, for setting an inviting table for all of us to address the questions that we're all grappling with together. And also thank you for your work at HUD. I appreciate your comment about doing everything in your power. We know that you do that every day, and we can't thank you enough. So I'm just here to make a couple little notes about an adjustment to the program due to unexpected events. The moderator, Corianne Scally, will not be here today, and I'll step in as the moderator for this panel. And one of our panelists, Noah Kazis, is also not available. He can't join, but I encourage you all to check out his paper on the event page. It's a very thought-provoking paper, as you can tell from the title, The Weakness of Neighborhood Revitalization Planning in the LIHTC program, Warnings from Connecticut. And that is co-authored with Catherine O'Regan. So I will now become the moderator. Watch this transition. I want to thank our two panelists who are here today. Erin Burrell, who's Housing Data Analyst at the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies at UCLA, and Noemi Sportiche, researcher at Mathematica and an associate at Harvard University. Thank you for joining us today. So a reminder again, you'll find their full bios as well as their papers online, so I encourage you to read those as well. And don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A online or in the room as they come up. So Noah, we'll start with you. You looked at whether the low-income housing tax credit in Connecticut, oh, that's Noah. Excuse me, I'm reading the old notes. You're not Noah. Don't let me do that, Aaron. Excuse me, everybody. Aaron, we're going to start with you.
Okay.
So you looked at California's law requiring local governments to affirmatively further fair housing in local housing plans. You look at whether it has made a difference in where affordable housing is sited locally within the area. So can you summarize what cities did in response to the new law, and tell us just a little bit about how you went about it and what you learned?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to set the context for everybody a little bit, California has a long-standing local housing plan process, which requires every city and county in the state to update a comprehensive local housing plan every 8 years or so. And the most recent set of plan updates just happened within the past 2-3 years for the rest of the urban areas. So this is the first time that local jurisdictions have actually been required to look at fair housing comprehensively within their local plans. So this is a big change for a lot of jurisdictions that had basically never really considered this before. And this led to cities essentially doing 3 things. So the first one was analysis. The state set out guidelines and required cities to do very comprehensive analyses of fair housing issues within their city limits. And these mostly followed a pretty boilerplate template where they followed the state guidance and didn't deviate too much. They're mostly okay. They're very similar to the federal assessments of fair housing, or AFHs, for those of you who are familiar with that. So that's the first thing they did, provided a lot of analysis. The second, and probably more important thing, is they were required, based off that analysis, to adopt a suite of policies, programs, and actions in order to meaningfully further fair housing within the city. And we found a little bit more of a mixed bag here. So we did a deep dive on 8 cities in the Southern California area, and we found that probably about 17% of the programs that cities were considering as affirmatively furthering fair housing programs were high impact, and about half of them were low impact. And as an example, almost a quarter of the city's programs were related to education and outreach. Education outreach is good. I'm not suggesting that it's not, but just having meetings or distributing flyers is probably not going to meaningfully change fair housing outcomes for lots of residents when, in our opinion, a lot of the challenges come to land use and infrastructure policies. And so we didn't see a lot of that within the city's actions. The third thing that cities need to do is they need to plan for new housing sites, especially affordable housing sites, and they're supposed to do that in an equitable manner that decreases segregation and increases access to opportunity for all the protected classes that are covered by the Fair Housing Law. And we found that most cities did not do this. Most cities are disproportionately planning for new affordable housing in their lower income, their more polluted, and their less white neighborhoods. Not all cities, but most cities are doing it disproportionately there. And so we think that there's a lot of opportunity within the next round of plan updates to change that, have better guidance for cities, and really get cities to change land use policies in exclusionary neighborhoods where it's most needed.
Well, thank you. And I'm relating that to Solomon's comments about place and decisions about what is best for folks. Great, thank you so much. And we'll come back with some more discussion about that. Noemi, your research looked at the unique fair share housing policy in Massachusetts, Chapter 40B, that allows the state to override restrictive. I'll let you tell us what the law is. How about that? And then what your research found out about it.
Yeah, sure. So similar to Erin, I'll start by setting the context a little bit. And it's well established, as we all know in this room, that restrictive local zoning practices have many negative consequences, from everything from overall housing production and housing costs to segregation. And 40B was enacted in 1969 explicitly to overcome those exclusionary zoning practices, but really just to deal with the racial and economic segregation component. It's not actually designed to deal with the fact that we're not producing enough housing. And the way that 40B achieves that is that it basically mandates that all municipalities in Massachusetts have to maintain their fair share, or at least 10% of their housing as affordable. And then it enforces that with a carrot and stick approach. So the most commonly referred to component of 40B is the stick, which is in municipalities that don't meet that 10%, so they have less than 10% affordable housing, developers can essentially have the means of bypassing local zoning regulations if they propose a development where some minimum proportion of the units in that development are affordable. And then the carrot side is that in municipalities with more than 10% housing, or 10% or more, or really any municipality, 40B allows developers to kind of streamline the permitting process of applying for affordable housing through the comprehensive 40B permit, which, again, if they propose a development that meets the same criteria I just mentioned. So pretty interesting policy from both sides. And it's actually produced a decent amount of housing since it was enacted. So today it accounts for about 20% of the affordable units in Massachusetts. But there's really valid reasons to be concerned that the policy isn't distributing those units in a way that's consistent with the goal of racial and economic desegregation. In particular, there's concern that the kind of wealthy white municipalities that are kind of restrictively zoned are still finding ways not to build any affordable housing at all under 40B. And if they are, that they're citing that housing in areas that might actually be harmful to the beneficiaries of the program, such as, for instance, by highways where there's a lot of pollution. That is kind of the key question, the first question that we ask here, which is to really understand, well, to what extent, where are these 40B developments actually located? And to what extent are these concerns valid? So, is the law succeeding? And actually, in quite a change to many of the different projects that we have in the housing space, we have a pretty uplifting story. So not only do we find that the average affordable 40B unit is permitted in those wealthy white privileged suburbs, but we also find that actually those 40B units are in pretty average neighborhoods in those municipalities. So we actually don't find that these concerns are really valid, and that this suggests that actually the policy, at least at an average level, is functioning as intended.
Hooray. It's something to celebrate, let people want
I know, a rare outcome.
Yeah, it's a long way from research to policies, and then those policies, we'll take a look at those policies and then figure out how we can refine and make them work better. And both of you have done a great job of illustrating that. So let's dig a little deeper into each of these two, and then we can talk a little more about what does it all mean taken together. So Erin, your research calls out what some would call opportunity hoarding. I think, in a way your research alluded to, Noemi, but especially by white affluent neighborhoods. To help make opportunity available to all, your team developed and tested a fair housing land use score. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and what it shows and how to use it?
Yeah, so the Fair Housing Land Use Score, or the FLUS, which is the acronym of it, and so you'll know that's what it means if I say that, is essentially a spatialized Gini coefficient. So a Gini coefficient measures income inequality, and what the Fair Housing Land Use Score does is it measures inequality of a public policy across a city. And it has a couple of major advantages. So the first is it can measure different types of policies. So we apply it to the siting of low-income housing sites and, say, distribution of multifamily zoning. But you could also look at something like park access or infrastructure investment. It can measure all of those things. So it's useful because it's flexible. The second thing it does is it allows us essentially to measure those across different neighborhoods. And it does that with a single score. The score ranges from -1 to +1. And it shows whether that policy is concentrated in lower opportunity neighborhoods or higher opportunity neighborhoods. The thing that's nice is you can measure different indicators of opportunity. So we tend to use median income. Income tracks lots of different types of opportunity, so it's probably the most important. But we've also done it for pollution, we've done it for transportation access, we've done it for racial composition of neighborhoods, and you can apply it to anything else. The third benefit of the score is that it's flexible across geographies. And so it tends to work best in kind of medium to large cities, but you can apply it regionally, you can apply it statewide if you were interested in that too, to see how these policies are affecting different places. There are a couple limitations, of course, when you use an index like this. It doesn't work as well for really small cities. So you can imagine if a city doesn't have a big difference between the neighborhoods, maybe there's only 1 or 2 neighborhoods within the city or within the area that you're studying, this is probably not going to be the most effective tool. Also for really large rural areas, it tends to not work as well either, just because the scale is thrown off by the amount of land that those places have. So the sweet spot is places with about 15,000 people or more than 4 different neighborhoods that you can measure, and larger than that.
Great. Can you give us a nutshell way of something that showed you really, that made something really clear in your work?
Yeah, so I think maybe I didn't explain this as well as I could have earlier. What it allows us to do is just say, like, is the city concentrating this policy in low opportunity areas or high opportunity areas? And so a score of -1 would mean, hey, all of this policy is applying within the lowest income or lowest opportunity neighborhood within that jurisdiction. And it measures things on a cumulative basis. And so you can, it's easier to explain with a graph, I'll be honest with you. But
We'll get you a marker.
yeah,
I'll take your word for it. I just wondered
Yeah,
how a
yeah.
policymaker, or like how somebody in a city might have been able to gain some additional clarity
Yeah.
from that to help make a decision better. If you had an example, for example.
I think we haven't seen it being used by cities yet, but what it does is it provides an objective metric that cities can point to and regulators, higher level regulators, can point to say, hey, this policy is inequitable or it's not inequitable, or you're doing what the law requires or you're not. Of course, we would suggest everything needs to be contextualized. Each city is different. We need to make assumptions too, and I would encourage everybody who uses the Fair Housing Land Use Score, it's not the end all be all, but it should be a tool. And if your score, say, is like -0.7, which we have cities that, scored -0.7 or even lower, that says, hey, you're concentrating your new low-income housing in the areas with the least opportunity. That is contrary to the affirmatively furthering fair housing law, and you need to make a change to that policy.
Okay, well, here it is, folks. We'll promote the FLUS with a name like that. It's got to be good. And plus, we all want to be able to use that and work that into our regular vocabulary. So, Noemi, you sort of have a similar question facing you, right? So the differences in neighborhood outcomes between 40B communities and communities with other types of assisted housing, how did that look? Did it make a difference? Could you tell the relationships there, and anything else you can talk about? Differences in these way these things were distributed?
Yeah, so obviously the purpose of 40B is really to, at least from the housing siting perspective, is really to kind of place housing in these areas that have resisted it historically, right? So I think maybe one good way to illustrate that is to try to look at what do those neighborhoods actually look like relative to the neighborhoods that are available to the beneficiaries of, for instance, the LIHTC program, the Housing Choice Voucher program, whether it's project-based or tenant-based vouchers, and the public housing program. And what we find is really just kind of consistent with what we would expect, given that affordable 40B units are in these wealthy white suburbs that are very privileged, while LIHTC beneficiaries, housing choice voucher beneficiaries, and public housing beneficiaries are kind of living in these less affluent, more urban, less white areas. So, for instance, 40B neighborhoods are on average 20 to 30 percentage points whiter in a very white state already. So some of the whitest neighborhoods in Massachusetts, median household incomes are around twice as high. They tend to be zoned for single family uses as opposed to multifamily. And then as someone who also is a health policy researcher, I was particularly struck by the outcomes that affect kind of the well-being of children. So schools in 40B neighborhoods are really among the best schools in the state. They perform about 1.5 to 2 standard deviations higher than schools that are available to the beneficiaries of other programs. Opportunities for kids who grow up in the area seem to be better in adulthood, or outcomes, excuse me. And then also pollution. Aaron also mentioned pollution. We find kind of across the board, like you would expect if there's kind of less traffic, vehicular traffic and other things, that pollution is reasonably lower in neighborhoods with 40B development. So again, it's just really permitting housing in these very different types of areas than other programs are.
Great. So we're starting to get some questions coming in from the audience, and I'm trying to integrate those a bit into the flow. So this question is for Aaron, and it also goes with a question that I think we had sort of talked about in advance, or you had. What we can learn from your work on the pros and cons of AFFH as currently implemented in this particular goal of expanding affordable housing supply that's so important to now. And then the question here also related to that is, what actions do you think local advocates can take in California to improve the housing element or the equity plan or all those things in development?
Yeah, those are both great questions. I think the first thing that I would take away is there is a lot of value in the state passing its own AFFH law, because that applied across different presidential administrations, unlike the federal rule, right? And so the fact that it was tied directly into state law and then also directly integrated into the existing planning process and the housing process provide a lot of value. Unfortunately, I don't think AFFH lived up to its potential in these housing plans for California, and that's due to a couple of reasons. But the first one, and this is something that will hopefully be different next cycle, is that the guidance and the expectations from the state housing department came out very, very late. They came out actually after San Diego's housing plans were due. So like one of the biggest regions in the state didn't know how they were supposed to implement this rule and this law before they were updating their plans. And so having expectations set early for cities and say, hey, AFFH is important, you need to bake it into the whole process. Every part of your government should be furthering fair housing. I think that will help a lot. The second thing is adopting some type of quantitative or objective metrics, both for programs, for housing sites. You know, it could be the Fair Housing Land Use Score, but it doesn't need to be. But having something objective that cities and state regulators can at least use to evaluate these plans is really important, because basically cities are incentivized to say, hey, our plans are good, because if they don't do that, they face a lot of penalties from the state. And so there's a lot of pressure on cities to find themselves in compliance or to demonstrate that they're doing a good job. But if they're not objectively doing a good job, things need to change. And so adopting objective metrics and making sure that the guidance is set early and that the cities can have a streamlined process to comply with that guidance, I think is really important.
So that would be state level advocacy in California.
Yeah, that's one thing. I think there's a lot of changes that can be made to California's housing planning process, and it's probably a little too much to talk about all of them right now. But I think advocating for objective metrics, especially for fair housing, is one of the most important things we can do.
And do the advocates have a big voice in the planning process itself in this regime, the California regime?
They're included, but I don't think they're not the main drivers of most of the process. California has really strict laws, and there's so many different laws, and sometimes they conflict. Really, compliance with the government code is the primary driver, not advocacy by neighborhood groups. But now new laws have changed it, so these different advocates have standing to sue cities that are doing bad jobs, and I think expanding that is something that will be really helpful and keep cities accountable.
Well, thanks. And in that same vein, we've got the situation that state override of local zoning is quite contentious everywhere you go. In fact, 40B has been around for a long time, and we haven't seen many other states adopt that policy, even though it sounds like it's been effective. So what do your findings say about the role that state governments can play in expanding affordable housing at the community level within their states?
Yeah, I mean, so let me back up for a moment and say something that I think contextualizes my answer to this, which is that I very strongly agree with what Solomon was saying earlier around having a number of different policy approaches, because in practice we have to make trade-offs in terms of what those policies are actually achieving, where I really think the takeaway from this work on Chapter 40B is that it's a complement to other strategies that we have, because it's kind of opening up the range of, again, people should be able to live everywhere, not just in some areas. And so it's kind of opening that up. So in terms of what that means for the role of the state, I mean, I think our research pretty clearly shows that, and as we've suspected, I think that, state or federal oversight of some kind of local zoning is important and can, when done in certain ways, which we can discuss a little bit more later, actually kind of produce, at least from a housing siting perspective, more equitable outcomes. We're not talking about the beneficiaries of the program, which I think is super important and something that we can also discuss more later if folks are interested. But I think in terms of what states should be doing, I think the kind of gut reaction I have heard people make to 40B is to say, well, this policy was enacted in 1969. It's really unusual. Other states don't do this, and the political climate now is different. How are we going to enact something like this in our state today? And I think maybe the lesson to take away here is, putting aside the idea of kind of passing a piece of legislation that's a carbon copy of 40B, I think that there are particular lessons that we can learn that might actually be able to be either adapted into existing policies and or added on into policies that are passing to kind of, for instance, address issues in housing production, which a lot of states are passing bills there. Prohibition on the basis of sex or discrimination on the basis of sex was actually tacked on to the Civil Rights Act. And I think we have opportunities to tack on equity-oriented legislation to legislation that's passing around housing production across a really wide variety of states. And then to the first point of, 40B is kind of a unicorn, I have been surprised by the number of states that ostensibly have some form of fair share policy on the books already, actually. So I'll just list some of the ones that I know, but if I were a state trying to enact this, the first thing I would do would be to turn to my books and see, is this something that's already there? And maybe it's just languishing and I can kind of revive it. So the ones that I'm aware of course, are New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Illinois, Oregon, California, and actually the greater Minneapolis area, oddly, has one as well, which I believe is one of the examples of ones that's kind of languishing on the books, but technically there.
So another tip for the advocates at the state level there. I have a couple of really good questions here that kind of speak to what Solomon raised, so I kind of want to try to synthesize those, and I'll try to kind of pull words out of them, but just so you have time to think about it, it has to do with where the things are placed and what's the right answer, shall we say, about that. There's a policy focus on moving low-income families to wealthy neighborhoods. Why is it so important to integrate these neighborhoods? And then another question relates to the one missing aspect of place-oriented research relates to burdens and benefits for residents of currently or historically excluded areas. There are places that won't serve me as well, where my sense of belonging would be missing, but it's hard to find decent housing in any type of neighborhood. So back to the question that Solomon raised about the dichotomy. How would you consider resident neighborhood and presence in an AFFH tool or in designing and assessing 40B regulations?
Do you want to take that one first, Aaron?
Sure. I think I would agree with Solomon that it's about expanding choice. In a lot of these very wealthy exclusionary neighborhoods, there's no choice to move in there if you're not rich, right? And so making sure that there are at least options. I don't think it's about necessarily moving people, but it's about creating options for people to move there if they want to. And right now, most of the exclusionary neighborhoods don't have any of that. And so I think that's what I would say to the first one. And to the second point, I think it really is important that we invest in communities that have been historically divested from too. And so there needs to be a balancing act. And of course, for the Fair Housing Land Use score, it ranges from -1 to 1. An ideal score would probably be a little bit, it'd be close to 0 either way. +1 would mean you're investing everything in the highest income neighborhood, or -1 means the lowest. I think that that's not balanced, and you wouldn't want that. You wouldn't necessarily want one of those scores. You want something that's more even to say, hey, we're taking care of every community here. We're not going to only prioritize one or the other.
Yeah, I very strongly echo what Aaron said. I think this is why we actually called our paper Expanding Neighborhood Choice, because I think we know that a lot of restrictive zoning policies have discriminatory intent, and I don't think those are things that we should uphold. And It's a very sticky problem, which is why I suspect it looks like we're only focusing on this. It's just very hard to kind of address this issue in order to give people of different incomes, of different racial backgrounds, choices based on what they want. But right now, I agree that that just kind of doesn't exist. And that's the reason I think we've been focusing on this set of issues. But I agree that, again, I think this is where 40B to me is a complement to the other tools we have, because it is important to build housing that is safe and decent and healthy everywhere that people can afford. And this has just not been on the table so far.
Great. No, I hear agreement there. But when I look at both of your papers, just on the surface of it, in a quick read, there's kind of a discrepancy here. In some ways, you're like, yeah, the policies aren't working that well. And you're saying they're working surprisingly well. But I think there's something to be learned from these two different findings, because you're talking about different tools. And then since you're standing in for Noah here, and I know you're familiar with his work a bit as well, if you have any thoughts about how his piece speaks to that. But what can we learn from putting these 2 or 3 papers together, and what's it telling us?
I think it's telling me that state level preemption is a good thing, and that echoes the last point that she just made. State level preemption is probably the most important thing, because when you give local jurisdictions power to choose, in this case, low income housing sites, or set their zoning rules in a specific way, there is a lot of pressure for them to do that in a way that's inequitable and to preserve existing neighborhoods and not allow new housing there, especially new low-income housing in these neighborhoods, right? So having mechanisms at the state level that bypass that local control and get housing built in exclusionary neighborhoods, I think is one of the most important things that will pretty much work everywhere. And reflecting on Noah's paper, this echoes a little bit of what I was saying in the last answer, is that having standards and metrics and expectations laid out clearly from the beginning is super important. I think that most cities will comply with those metrics, with those laws, as long as they know what to do. They might not be happy about it. A lot of cities in California were kicking and screaming through the entire housing plan process. For example, Beverly Hills is very famous. It had a allocation last cycle of 3 units, and that went up to 3,000. And so that's a huge jump for a place like Beverly Hills. And they didn't like that, but they got sued by the state because they weren't meeting their goals. And so having those expectations set clearly, both for cities as well as LIHTC developers, which is what Noah wrote about, I think will get better outcomes too.
Yeah, and just to build on what Erin was saying, I think the first thing I would say is that I think one of the reasons and one of the differences maybe between these policies, in addition to the fact that I think it's pretty clear what 40B is doing, the law is very simple actually, but in addition to that, it's actually enforced pretty strictly. And we actually have some suggestive evidence that that's one of the reasons why the law has been effective. So, around the year 2000, a little bit before, the state really started tracking municipal compliance with that 10% standard. And that paired with, the legal system in Massachusetts has really kind of made the threat of that zoning bypass very real, and also allowed developers to think, hey, this is a real option for me. And so I think that no matter what we write in the letter of the law, actually enforcing that is a crucial element to actually getting outcomes that we think are the right outcomes. And then the last thing I'll share about this is just sort of a reflection. We haven't looked at this empirically, but I think one interesting difference between what Noah was talking about and Erin, housing elements law, and 40B is that 40B is kind of a developer-driven process. So the developer applies for a comprehensive permit. It's not the municipality that makes a plan and decides where things go. The municipality then reacts to the developer, and there's some negotiation that happens there. But again, it's led by a different component of the development process, which also may explain why 40Bs are in these average neighborhoods, because that's probably where developers want to build.
Yeah, which brings us back to the LIHTC question again.
Yeah, and if I could jump in there too, California has a little bit of a version of that with something called the builder's remedy, which essentially allows developers to bypass zoning and comprehensive plan rules if the city hasn't passed its plan on time and done a good enough job. And some preliminary evidence that we're seeing is that most of the projects that take advantage of that program are in high opportunity cities. We're still collecting that, and some advocates have been really leading that work over at IMBY Law. But we're seeing essentially the same thing that you're seeing. When developers have that choice to bypass zoning and to build low-income or mixed-income housing, they will do it in high-opportunity cities and high-opportunity neighborhoods.
Yeah, I was excited. My co-authors and I were very excited to see the Builder's Remedy discussion in California.
It came up in one of the audience questions, so we can satisfy that question. I have a couple really cool questions, and I wondered if I can just offer you one each with short answers, and then we can go to our closing out question. One for you, Noemi, is if there's been anything qualitative or otherwise on the quality rates on the integration of those living in 40B units into community structures and utilization of resources available to their residents. Like what, you talked a little bit about that, but
yeah,
can you?
So I will say that this work that I'm talking about today is really the foundation of like a many year, many octopus, multi-armed set of projects where we're really ultimately trying to understand what it's really like for the people who are moving to these neighborhoods and what the outcomes for them are like. Because again, as a health policy researcher, I'm always thinking about people. That's the kind of element that we care about, and I think the reason why we care about these housing programs. So there's a little bit of work that exists on that already, the Citizens Housing Action and Planning. I always forget what CHAPA stands for, but CHAPA is a major player in Massachusetts, and I should know what it stands for. But they've done a little bit of interviewing of the residents of 40B developments, but it's really a small sample size, and we kind of can't derive very much from that. We have been working on trying to gather qualitative information, especially focused on experiences of discrimination in these neighborhoods, which I think may take place in many different forms, recognizing that quantitative measures are really limited in what they tell us about what experiences are actually really like in these areas, but we don't have findings on that yet. So,
so more to come.
So much more to come.
We'll look forward to that. And then, Aaron, you talked about maybe lower impact activities. There was a question about could you name some what you consider to be high impact interventions coming out of the planning?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are cities that said, hey, we're going to comprehensively change zoning across all neighborhoods. One of them is Culver City, which is famous for having the Sony Picture Studios there. And so they upzoned basically the whole city. And that's one example. There are other cities that said, hey, we're going to do comprehensive infrastructure investments in communities that haven't seen that before. We're going to improve their parks, we're going to improve their roads, we're going to improve their transportation. And so that's another example of something that we would consider a really high impact, because there's going to be a tangible difference on the ground from what the city's doing. The city's committing funding, it's committing time to doing that, versus it's something that doesn't really require the city to do much, like updating a website.
Good, that's very helpful. And so I'm going to kind of ask you to wrap it up here on some of the things we've been talking about. There's a number of questions that kind of get to this: what can we do about our state laws? What would you recommend states doing to expand based on your research? What can local governments do based on your research, even if they're in states where maybe they're not getting that kind of support? And then, similar questions about, let's just leave it at that. If you can talk about recommendations for states and local governments as well out of this
Yeah,
work.
sure, I can go first. So I think I've echoed a few of these already, but I'll just say, I think in looking at the different types of outcomes that we see in these different programs, I think it's really important to start by always thinking about what the goal of your program actually is, right? So, bypassing exclusionary zoning has many negative consequences. So thinking about which specific elements of that you're trying to address and then addressing that in the ways you think based on research is most effective, I think is important. I've sort of mentioned already, I think, the different legal opportunities we might have to actually pass and or adapt things that are already on the books. But I really want to underscore the enforcement piece. I mean, I think that's, often difficult to actually implement, but I think really important, an important takeaway here. And something that we haven't discussed yet around that is, again, different systems within the state are enforcing. It's not just one component. It's not just, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. It's also the legal system. So I think having these multiple arms of enforcement is important. And then the last thing is, I think, to Erin's comment about the builder's remedy as well, I think we need a stick for these measures if we're thinking about, adding regulation that is going to bypass zoning. Though we might consider also approaches like Montana's Land Use Planning Act, which removes regulation and may have at least some similar flavor of outcomes as a result.
Yeah, and I think I agree with everything you just said, but I would also add that the states need to really think about what the goal is overall, and make sure that they don't have other policies or laws that might be conflicting with that already. So that California is famous for that with its housing planning process. There's so many different pieces. It's been a law that has evolved since the late 60s all the way till now, and things keep being tacked on. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it also means that there are sections of the law that incentivize cities to not further fair housing, even though there's a whole section of the state code that says you need to further fair housing. So there are a lot of different pieces, and probably coming up with something comprehensive and in one swoop is the best approach, especially for states that already have existing processes like this. The other thing, and I'll say it again, is that preemption works. It's working for the builder's remedy in California. It works for accessory dwelling units or backyard cottages in California. Those weren't really legal until a couple of years ago, and now it's about 25% of the state's housing production. And that unlocks new neighborhoods. It allows people to age in place. There's a whole slew of benefits for unlocking these accessory dwelling units. That's something that a lot of cities were resistant to, and now they've embraced because they can see the benefits of it. And it's a good fair housing tool also. And then third, objective metrics where possible. Of course, one objective metric isn't going to tell you the whole story, and so they need to be couched within community experiences and community knowledge. We 100% believe in that too, but having a check at least to say, hey, is this policy equitable or not in an objective way is really important, because some cities might not be trying to do the wrong thing. Maybe some are, but I don't think most are, and they might just not know. And so to the extent you can have higher level governing bodies, whether they be regional councils of government or state governments, checking that and reviewing things from an objective lens, I think that's a very helpful step to get cities moving in the right direction.
Well, thank you. I think I'm hearing you need clear goals, and those need to be translated into clear rules. You need metrics, especially around equity. You need enforcement, and you need sticks. Preemption is valuable, but you also need carrots. And I think you don't need to start from scratch either, because we've heard 2 examples, 3 if you read the 3rd paper. I'm sure they're all over the country, good models to build on. And finally, of course, you need research throughout the process to make sure you're on the right track. So I want to thank our panelists and for their time today. Great job, great work. And invite my colleague Tina Stacy and the next panel up.
Do we have?
Are we? Yes, bringing another chair. Okay, great. Thank you guys again. Appreciate it.
All right, hello everyone. Thanks for that great panel, Yannicka and the panel before us, such a deep conversation. And I'm really excited about our next panel to dig more into policies to expand options for equity-oriented affordable housing. My name is Tina Stacy. I'm a principal research associate here at the Urban Institute. I'm really excited to introduce the panelists for our next session, which is about evidence on outcomes for households and residents. So first we have Lisa Bates, who's a professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University. Thank you for being here. Next up, we have Chris Donald, the executive director and CEO for the DC Housing Finance Agency. Thanks so much for joining. And finally, we have Haidar Kurbin, a professor of economics at Howard University.
Thank you.
As a reminder, please enter your questions for the panelists at any time in the Q&A box, and we'll reserve the last few minutes to answer just a few of them. We won't have a ton of time, but please enter any questions you have along the way. So I was hoping each of you could give just a brief overview of either the paper you're here to discuss, or in Chris's case, just a little bit about your background and the work that you do. So Lisa, could you tell us first about your research on preference policies in Portland?
Sure. So our team at Portland State for about 5 years has been researching a really innovative and kind of first of its kind policy that the city of Portland has. After 60-some years of repeated urban renewal activity in North and Northeast Portland, which is Portland's historically Black neighborhoods, through a very intense community pressure campaign, the city adopted a new policy attached to its current urban renewal area in Northeast. And I'll just bracket that, yes, in the city of Portland still uses the term urban renewal area, but today it's a tax increment finance, a TIF district. So that starting in about 2017, new affordable housing, both rental and homeownership, has a prioritized wait list based on intergenerational residents in the urban renewal areas dating back to 1957. To thread the needle of fair housing law, it is not a race-based policy, but it is based on a grandparent, parent, or yourself, or equivalent generations living in the area. So it's designed to address history and family connection. And our study, we surveyed and interviews and focus groups with residents across 2 time periods of these new buildings to look at their well-being, their economic, social, emotional, and kind of community well-being.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I have so many questions. I'm going to hold off. Yeah, it's really interesting policy, and I know a lot of other cities are enacting similar ones. I know Boston has a similar one there. They are building affordable housing on vacant land in the city and are using similar preference policies. So really excited to hear more about the nuances of the impacts you're finding there. Chris, could you tell us a little bit about your work that you do with the DC Housing Finance Agency?
Sure. My name is Christopher Donald, and I run the DC Housing Finance Agency. And you can think about us as an investment boutique bank for affordable housing here in the district. So most of the larger multifamily projects that you see that are receiving Housing Production Trust Fund, we're generally in the financing equation. So we have about 50 folks at the agency, a budget of about $20 million a year, and we finance about $300 million in tax-exempt bonds. But when we think about equity and how we kind of come into that conversation, it's actually at many different layers, from the residents, our homeowners, all the way up to the practitioners, and introducing this idea of bringing a variety of diverse practitioners to the business of creating this housing, because they bring different perspectives, right? And they engage in such a way that is informed by those experiences that we ultimately think makes communities more dynamic.
Awesome. And we're excited to hear more about all of the new tools you've been developing and all those things throughout this discussion. Thanks for being here. Haidar, can you tell us a little bit about your work on inclusionary zoning in DC? Thanks.
Hi, I'm glad that I'm here. I work at Howard University as a professor of economics. I'm an urban economist. I'm also director of a Center of Excellence in Housing, Urban Research, and Policy. It's called CHIRP. This is a center that was funded by HUD 3 years ago. And we kind of expanded on the center. And the center is conducting research in a lot of housing-related projects. So this is one of them that was funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and HUD. So inclusionary zoning program is a very interesting program, is because it's as I'm going to explain the research, it's kind of tries to address the affordable housing issues, right, in the growing neighborhoods, in the neighborhoods that have new developments, especially new rental properties or own properties. So make sure that it includes, right, the lower income residents who would otherwise would not afford to live there. So this is kind of the purpose of the program. So we looked at this program to kind of to see that, first, does the program works as it was designed? Second, who are the beneficiaries? Third, whether the program really kind of have some other benefits that I'm going to talk about in this paper, that because we have information, right, in the data set about where the applicants are coming from, their neighborhoods, and where they are going. So we can compare their neighborhoods, right, whether they are in the better neighborhoods. And also within DC's context, it's very interesting because DC, when people talk about neighborhoods, right, you look at all kinds of neighborhood benefits, and another one is kind of schooling, right, whether people end up in the better school districts, right. In DC, charter schools are big. And the kind of the connection between the schools and the residents is a little bit broken, right? So, and also in DC, they're not that much in new developments because it doesn't have much land to expand. So I think for these reasons, this is a very interesting program to study, and maybe, and because many other cities, they implement this policy, and this is in a very peculiar place, right? So we can see kind of in a place that land is limited, right? The IZ program is mandatory. The schools, this district system is a little bit different, and then we can kind of get some learn something from. So we can talk about other cities where land might be more available, right? So so this is kind of the way we structure this, and we have like a couple papers on this. Today I'm going to talk about whether the applicants and those who successfully get housing, whether they are living in the better neighborhoods in terms of whether the neighbors are greener, they have more restaurants or lower crime, and the value of the information we have on the original neighborhood and the destination neighborhood. So we compare that, and what we found is that it seems like the program is really benefiting those who are successfully getting the properties. And let me just tell you another thing is that this is very popular, the rental IZ, inclusion zoning in DC. We have in our data set 57,000 lottery applicants, and only 846 people, right, successfully got rental housing through the program between 2008 and 2021. The program was in the place in 2011. 2009 it was implemented, but it took some time to be implemented. 2011 and 2. So we are now collecting data for other years. So it is a small program. It has some effects, but it seems like the effects are positive. I'll be happy to talk about more.
Yeah, that's great. And it's interesting because inclusionary zoning, which we might say IZ for short, try to avoid the acronyms, but there's very little research on it. If you look at something like rent control, which has been massively studied, there's very little research on IZ. So it's really great to see more research coming out on that. Lisa, turning back to you. So like you mentioned in your paper, you look at the City of Portland's preference policy, which provides 10 targeted affordable rental housing to residents displaced from a historically Black neighborhood. You do find that the preference policies can enhance well-being, but you also note, though, that the majority of residents felt their lives, while the majority of residents felt their lives improved since moving into preference policy housing, many still identified vulnerabilities to their well-being. What are some of the companion policies that you think policymakers should implement in tandem with these types of policies to mitigate some of these vulnerabilities?
Yeah, and in our work, I want to make sure to note that we had a community advisory group made up of residents, both of these affordable rental buildings and also others, longstanding folks in the neighborhood, neighbors in the neighborhood, to help us to kind of develop what this suite of policies should be. But really, these challenges stem out of the same problem as the TIF process did in the first place. So the 2000 TIF district creation in Northeast Portland promised an extensive community development activity, sort of suite of activities to support people living in the neighborhood. In Oregon, TIF funds can only be used for bricks and sticks. So everything else that might happen in a comprehensive community initiative has to get funded elsewhere. That remains the case. So the preference policy is a wait list management strategy for affordable housing. It does not have, in and of itself, a full complement of community development activities. So people do have really positive experiences in terms of, obviously living in a income restricted and subsidized housing does address some of their housing cost challenges and certainly makes it possible to access neighborhoods that are extremely expensive in Portland. They're simply kind of nicer neighborhoods than where most people who are displaced land in terms of their physical infrastructure, parks, green space, transit access, nearby employment, major employers, et cetera. That's why these neighborhoods gentrified in the first place, because they are lovely places. And people feel really deeply connected. When you think about Portland's Black community, you might not think about Portland's Black community. We're only about 6% of the population. Before, really these neighborhoods gentrified, about 90% of Black Oregonians lived in this district. So people are very deeply connected to place. They still have a lot of friends, families, and institutions, schools, et cetera, with historical connections. But it's very expensive for daily living. So some way to address more comprehensively the availability of a commercial sector that would cater to all income ranges would be very important. And ways to help people connect to the sorts of kind of economic advances that they would like to make in living in the neighborhood. They truly have much better access to major employers, some of our eds and meds, and to childcare infrastructure. They can get around more easily. But many of the folks that we spoke to said, if I begin to advance economically, that I can't live in this affordable housing, there is nowhere to go in this neighborhood that I could possibly afford. You fall right off a cliff in housing costs and you will be out of the neighborhood again. And now, maybe you're on an hour and a half bus ride back to this job that you found. And so ways to kind of step out of that subsidized below 60% AMI unit would be really, really important. And then I think lastly, but I cannot understate this, is to have a group of folks who have deep historical ties in a community, in a neighborhood, interacting with a vastly majority white and quite wealthy, I think it's both a race and a class-based issue in the neighborhood, who have moved to Portland. I mean, not even just moved into the neighborhood, but have moved to the region in the last 20 years, who may have no idea that what they've moved into is a historically Black neighborhood. This district is now only about 20% African American. And so there's a lot of confusion and consternation about what is exactly going on, what cultural events attempt to have a resurgence of Black cultural events are met with the kinds of things I think we're used to, the noise complaints, the police being called, the daily microaggressions on the street. And so the folks that we spoke with and work with in our advisory group were very intent about, we should have had an entry back into the neighborhood that we consider our home, that was smoothed for us by these community-based organizations. Have a block party, introduce us to our neighbors, have more historical and cultural kind of education at large, and help us also to engage in the kind of civic and political spaces in the neighborhood associations, the city council district, et cetera, that would let us have a voice in the place that we live in, but really deeply consider to be our home.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting, and this really gets at something that quantitative researchers, who I blame myself for this as well, often miss when we're looking at statistics and numbers, is these measures of belonging. And like we've talked about before, just because you're close to something doesn't mean you're really able to access it. And so really, I think this speaks to the importance of community engaged research, community partnering research. And then also your comment about, businesses. We often forget when places are gentrifying and people are getting displaced, that often involves Black and brown serving or businesses as well, Black-owned businesses. And so thinking about these comprehensive policies that can help them stay in place. And there are many affordable housing initiatives, one in my city, which I love, where the first floor is gonna be open for local businesses to be able to have an affordable space to continue serving residents in a neighborhood that is rapidly gentrifying. So it's super interesting. Chris, turning to you. So as a practitioner, which tools do you find to be the most effective at increasing equity in housing in the DC area in kind of a scalable way? And could you tell us about some of the tools you mentioned that you all have created to help address wealth gaps?
Sure. So I'm going to take a whack at the second part of the question. We started asking ourselves probably in the last 2 or 3 years about home ownership and how the agency could have a much larger impact around the idea of home ownership. The mayor convened her Black Home Ownership Strike Force a couple of years ago. There were some initiatives that came out of that, the largest being creating 20,000 net new Black homeowners by 2030, right? And so we took that challenge very seriously. But as we looked at the problem, what we understand is that we only control one lever in that ecosystem, right? And that is the lever of mortgage finance. But we started asking the bigger question about what does equity mean in home ownership, and really challenging some of the vocabulary that folks use around home ownership and this idea of wealth building, right? Wealth in this country is defined by 2 commas, right? And that's 2 commas of liquidity. And so typically if you're going to be wealthy, you're going to have a net worth of $2 to $5 million. Most regular Americans aren't going to experience that in their home buying process, right? So what does it mean to actually buy a home, transform your life, and to create opportunities for generations that are coming in front of you? When does that actually happen in the home buying process? So we started asking this question and playing with ideas. And so our typical borrower through our DC Open Doors program, which is our mortgage program, I've dubbed her Taylor, right? So Taylor's 33 years old. She makes about $80,000 a year. She's very single. She's very childless. She's very happy, right? Taylor uses brunch as a verb. She's on TikTok. She's on IG. She's living her best life. She's all that we could hope for in the melanated rainbow. And so Taylor makes us very happy. And so our question was, how do we and where do we find more Taylors, right? And then once we find Taylor, how do we really empower Taylor to transform her life, right? We also took a look at income inequality. MITRE has this really cool income inequality calculator, like you can just nerd out on. I'm not a researcher, but I get on there, I'm like, ooh, right? And so what you do is you take Taylor. I've told you a little bit about Taylor, right? A little bit more is that she's got probably $40,000 in student debt. She's got no inheritance from her parents or grandparents, right? And more than likely, Taylor's helping somebody else out in the family. 20 years from now, if you look at Taylor, her net worth is going to be 0, could be negative, right? She may have a little appreciation from home ownership, right? But if you look at her counterpart, Becky makes $160,000 a year. She has operating expenses of about $90,000, right? She's got an inheritance of $50,000, which earns 10% interest every year, right? She's got no student loans. And so 20 years from now, Becky has a net worth of $2 to $4 million. There's a huge gap. What can we do as housing finance people to help close that gap, right? And what we can do is figure out how do we unlock more equity for Taylor faster? That became a question that we really started to try to pull apart to figure out how we can deliver and inject some equity into the system, right? And so what we're toying with right now, we're in the midst of trying to build out, is a hyper amortizing or an accelerated mortgage that unlocks equity faster. So everybody knows when you typically get a mortgage, it's a 30-year mortgage. You go down to the bank, you get your mortgage, and away you go. And sometimes there's some different flavors where you can have an ARM where it's interest only for a period of time. In these rare occasions with these highly disciplined human beings, they have 15-year mortgages, typically unheard of, right? For those of us living paycheck to paycheck, we don't do that kind of thing, right? But is there a hybrid structure where you could have a portion of that mortgage be a conventional 30-year mortgage, and then a subsequent portion of that mortgage actually be on a 15-year timeline, right? We believe that there's a model to do that. And what it looks like is, particularly in a higher interest rate environment, this is where it gets really interesting, right? So my belief is if Taylor pays $3,000 for a normal mortgage, and I can help her have a faster paying mortgage and it's still $3,000, she shouldn't care. It's only when I make that payment burden higher that she may be uncomfortable. So now the work is on us to figure out how to go behind, right? And below the surface, figure out how to make that mortgage work. And we think the math is that if you have a mortgage, and let's just say today, your typical mortgage would be 7%, right? So we have a first, and make the numbers easy, let's say it's a $500,000 mortgage. So 80% of that mortgage is at 7%, $400,000, and you've got $100,000 left. If we make that $100,000 priced at 3% instead of that 7%, then Taylor's mortgage payment is the same as if she had a 7% $500,000 mortgage. However, by year 15 of that mortgage, Taylor now has $100,000 in equity in that home, right? And typically it would have taken till year 20, 21, 22, 23 before she freed up that kind of equity, right? So now when we look at that discrepancy of net worth over time, we're shortening her access, right, to the equity that she would have in that house. The real question is, how much faster can she now pay off the balance of that mortgage? And can we make a 30-year mortgage payable in 20 years without changing that payment burden, right? If we can figure out how to bring that secret sauce together, then we think we're going to be cooking with gas. And so the real question becomes, what are the funding mechanisms for that accelerated portion, right, which won't have a market interest rate attached to it, right? Can we raise that kind of money using resources from the agency? Can we tap into philanthropic organizations, right? Because ultimately what we also understand is we need to build a model that is self-perpetuating and sustaining. I do not believe that there's a long-term solution that exists with philanthropy by itself, right? I want to tap into the interest of the market. If we can align our interest and prove that through this process, by knowing who Taylor is, and by knowing that when you give Taylor an opportunity, she doesn't miss, she won't lose. Because what we know empirically is when we look at the programs that we fund, when we fund these borrowers, when we educate them, they're not the ones who experience default, right? They're usually much stronger, they're more educated, they're more prepared to be sustainable homeowners over a longer period of time. And so when we're thinking about equity, we are truly thinking about how do we empower our borrowers? How can we accelerate their access to equity in kind of a sustainable and a scalable way? And we think by structuring the mortgages in this way, it can become very compelling to the market, because when you start to talk about CRA, I can now tell you exactly whose loan you're buying, right? I can tell you what the characteristics of those buyers are going to be, how it's going to perform, et cetera. And we think that provides a really unique opportunity.
It's so interesting, because I feel like we've made massive strides in figuring out how to decrease that initial burden, of down payment assistance.
That's right.
But you so infrequently hear people talking about those longer term, like, well, okay, I can buy this house, but I can't afford to pay the mortgage, I can't afford to upkeep it, I can't,
right.
and so thinking about how can you get that equity quicker while still paying the same amount is really fascinating. So I'm really excited to see where that goes. Haidar, so your research shows that inclusionary zoning can help people with lower incomes move into neighborhoods that have increased access to grocery stores and pharmacies, reduced rates of adult asthma, and reduced crime incidents, like you mentioned. One concern about inclusionary zoning is that the units are generally not affordable to people with very low incomes, and that they're often not of a size needed for families. They're often studios or one bedrooms. Are there ways you think that IZ policies can be designed to address those concerns?
Yes, before I answer that, I think I know where Taylors are living, They are living in the inclusive zoning homes, right? Those units, because the research shows that the population that lives, in the inclusive zoning, units, of course, they have to apply and they have to be successful in the lottery, right? So those who were lucky and, in the lottery, they got the units, they are paying under, market rents. And generally, they are younger. They are families, small families, because in inclusionary zoning, one of the requirements is income, right? That is, your income has to be either below this, whatever the income that the agency wants, right, to be qualified, eligible for that. And the other one is that the household size. So, and since most of the rental, units are smaller, people with bigger housing, family size, they cannot apply to them because they're not available. There are very few of them. Actually, we have a map of this inclusionary zoning, units, where the people are applying, where the units are. So you just imagine, just look at the red line and the green line, right, from Silver Spring to downtown. You will see that most of the rental apartments are kind of closer to the metro lines, and the people are coming kind of around them, a little bit dispersed. So basically, those who are applying this program, these are renters, right? They are living somewhere, and they have to be DC residents. That is one of the requirements. And so they are living somewhere, right, close. And then they apply, and they get this new rental apartments which tend to be where the new developments are taking place. There is one region in DC, Northwest, that is it's kind of excluded from the inclusionary zoning because there are not that many apartments are built. Otherwise, wherever the city built, the developers build apartments, it is mandatory, and it's like 10 to 12% of the units. It's called density bonus. So if the zoning says that you can build 20 units, you can build 25. 5 units will be affordable for the inclusionary zoning for affordable units. Now, the beneficiaries of the program, right? They are not low income. They are mostly 50 to 60%, 80% area median income. There are very few applicants who can, live even if the market rent is below the market rate, they cannot afford to live in those units. So you have very few, 30%, below area median income population. It is also the income requirement is also problematic because they are looking at the, we are using the area. Area means DC plus other, areas around metro. And in DC, the median income is lower. So you're kind of, targeting a higher income, right, than the DC's median income. So the program, it really benefits those who have demand for lower units, smaller size, and those who are making kind of a lower to middle income population. So I'm going to talk about, because our focus was that is the program fair, right? I mean, and DC is different than other areas in the rental unit, IZ. It implements a lottery program for the rental units. And this is something different than Montgomery County. We did a paper on Montgomery County. And in that, the IZ rental part is really kind of left to the developers. So you say, okay, you just go and apply. So developers can, this is up to them, right? Here it's mandatory. Mandatory means, when the units are available, DC takes over. DC does the lotteries. And then from the lotteries, we looked at, those who came kind of at the top, right? They're ranked first and to 10, what happens to them? Because those who are like at the top rank, like 1 to 10, they can go and just apply for the unit. That is for their family size, right? And there are some, usually those who are ranked high, they get it. But sometimes there's a discrepancy because, either, the person's file might not be in place, right? Something happens and the first person might not get it, the second person will get it. But these are kind of similar people, right? I mean, that's the good thing about the lotteries, that, we're doing that. But very few larger families, these are smaller. And also, I mean, the demand is huge, 57,000 applicant pool, and you have like 850 units for 3 years. So if you kind of go over the years, it's not going to be more than a couple thousand, the units. Another thing is that sustainability, right? I mean, meaning that those who are getting the IZ units, rental units, right? Is that going to be permanent, right? I mean, of course, those who gets in, they get it, right? But what if somebody just gets out, right? And then are the developers, are they going to make it available, right? So for that, we're working with our partners, Office of Tax Revenue. We're looking at the DC's tax revenue files and to find out those who are living on those units and to see that, because we have the addresses of those units, right? The inclusionary zoning properties, right? Are they still housing them, right? Or something happened, because that's sustainability, right? That is something that, and that's kind of what we think about whether the program works, as it's designed or not, right? When the unit becomes available, it works, right? But over time, what happens to those units, right? Are they still, getting those residents, or something happens? And another issue is vacancy, right? Sometimes the developers, right, they keep them vacant rather than renting them out. So these are the issues that we're kind of grappling with, and to see, to see that really the real effect, the total effects of the units. Another thing is kind of to think about is that the impact in the rich neighborhoods, right, where they are already gentrified, let's say, right? The impact is more clear because there you are making some housing opportunities for lower income. But if you are changing the zoning laws, right, and building these apartments in the neighborhood that's just becoming gentrified, right? So what you are doing is that basically you are getting some 5-10 units, affordable units, but you are gentrifying the whole neighborhood. So it's kind of that dynamics that we want to study that too. But I was joking about, Taylor. I mean, it's just true, right? I mean, really, Taylor is the person that lives in those units. And the reason is because they are probably, if they're making 80,000, 70,000, they're paying below the market rate, right? They should be able to save some money for the down payment. And if they get an over, then maybe they are more ready, let's say, to buying a home, right? Because it gives them some time to pay below the market rate and save some money. The other thing is that in this research we find out is that the importance of community organizations. I mean, the IZ program works with two housing organizations, and they are kind of controlling the intake policy. And this is very important. What we found is that because without the involvement of community-based organizations, right, you wouldn't get minorities, African Americans, Hispanics, right, to participate with such a high participation rate, because they have a connection to the community, right? I mean, the program by itself cannot be race-based, right? It'll be illegal. But if you use the community-based organizations, they have connections to the community, and they can bring the people. For the IZ, they don't have race as a variable, but we can kind of estimate by looking at the names, some other fuzzy methods by using that. In the other program, for example, the HPAP program, the race is there, and 72% of the participants in the HPAP program are African Americans. So, and the reason is the community-based organizations that have connections to the community. So I think any kind of affordable housing program, right, which shows me and my colleagues at Howard University in the center that the importance of the community-based organizations to help people to participate to the program.
Yeah, it's interesting. And some of the points you noted kind of get at some of these other bigger questions about inclusionary zoning that we need more research on for researchers out there. Namely, if these units are kind of smaller units that are, moderately affordable, and if it depending on how the policy is designed, if it's incentivizing development in gentrifying neighborhoods, is it actually tearing down older buildings that may be a little bit more naturally occurring affordable and putting it, the questions, I think how the policy is designed, whether it's mandatory or optional, whether there are bonuses for development. And then that also relates to what effect inclusionary zoning might have on supply overall. If it is mandatory and very restrictive, are you actually reducing overall supply? And so I think there's still a lot of questions out there. But this point about there being a lottery and just a kind of a funnel of people, we've also interviewed developers who say that really helps them, right? Because in places without that, sometimes it's hard to find income eligible people for those units so they can sit vacant. So I think design is so important for inclusionary zoning, as with all of these policies. Great. Okay, so this question is for all of you, just based on some of the rich discussions I've had with you guys in the past. So, and it kind of speaks to some of Solomon's earlier comments about this dichotomy. People often see this dichotomy between policies that are kind of investing in neighborhoods where people with lower incomes live now versus policies that help people with lower incomes move into better neighborhoods. So vouchers versus, if we were going to be building more like, public housing. What are all of your takes on kind of the relative effectiveness of these? And are we even asking the right question? Is access to opportunity and segregation even the right framework to be using to think about these issues? I'll start with Lisa, because I know you have some great thoughts on this.
No, it's not. I think that we have spent a lot of time, many decades in this field, confusing and conflating some concepts together. One thing I'll note is in terms of our vision of neighborhoods. I talk about the city of Portland, that the vast majority of Black Oregonians are living in Northeast Portland during this long history of urban renewal. That's a neighborhood that was about 1/3 Black. That was, in some small segments, might be more, like half to 3/4 in a few census tracts. But the sight of Black people was defined as blighting to a community and a neighborhood. Do not look confused, because that's kind of how it works everywhere. That is the fundamental hierarchy, right? So we start from a premise that being around a lot of Black people is a bad thing, and that being next to white people is a better thing. That's a fundamental underlying premise here. But we don't really think about it in the other way around. So I'll just say, for me, when we talk about quote unquote access to opportunity and the conversation that's happened over again many decades, we're mistaking access, the noun, meaning proximity to something, with access as a verb. The ability to engage with a system or institution and receive the same benefits as anyone else. And the reality is that hasn't really happened across these policies, programs, or types of neighborhoods when you start to peel back the layers. So it works to move to opportunity if you're under 12. Well, great. So teens, adults, forget them. The original MTO program happened, I don't mind saying, I'm in my late 40s. I was already over 12 at the time. So that's some generations of people who don't get to access opportunity. It works, except for when you put Black race in there and then, oops, the effects kind of disappear, right? And so I think that we need to actually turn our gaze in a really different way. I think the reality is that we live in a country where the level of innovation, agility, and nimbleness in the race class hierarchy maintenance sector is unimaginable. The ability to constantly exclude and recreate exclusivity, whether you're next to something or riding the bus to something or you got to go to school there or whatever, we have to dig into the actual mechanisms through which people are not able to fully engage with and receive benefits from systems. And that means we can't look at what poor Black single moms are doing or not doing. We actually have to look at the other people. We have to look at the folks with money, and we have to look at the folks from dominant cultures and the people who uphold dominant culture ideologies and ask, what are you doing? What are we doing that is creating a system that reproduces and recreates a race and class hierarchy continually and forever?
Okay. Yes, 100%. I'm wondering if either of you have anything to add to that. That's a tough act to follow.
I think that there's a key concept that oftentimes we don't talk about when we talk about research and finance, right? And that's choice. I spent a lot of time talking with people in my office, and one of the things that one of my colleagues says, who's from the area, he was like, don't forget, just because you create this nice, pretty new building uptown, doesn't mean people across the river want to live there. Their churches aren't there, their stores aren't there, their community's not there. And so you can create these communities of opportunity, but if there's not an invitation extended to you by your neighbor, do you really want to be there? Got a long-term Washingtonian friend, she said, we let you come, can you let us stay? Right? So you can give me the money to buy the house, but you can't make my neighbor speak to me. It doesn't stop me from staying up at night wondering if my teenage son is going to be able to traverse that very neighborhood and get home without somebody calling the police on him, because they're not checking for my resume or my title or my ID, right? So as I think about where I want to go and what I want to do, that is certainly something that's on my mind outside of the schools, outside of the whole paychecks, right, that I want to shop at. All of those things are important, but there's also something about where do I feel most comfortable, right? And I don't know if that's something that we can address with policy, but it's not something that we can forget when we have these conversations, because simply building it and providing the financing for it and providing the regulatory framework doesn't make me want to be your neighbor.
Yeah.
And I'm not about trying to force you to be my neighbor, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm perfectly fine finding places where I am content and my family's safe.
I would love to be your neighbor. But no, I totally understand. And I think at the very least, we can.
But where can we find the policy moments, right? So, for example, you can go to a top-ranked K through 12 school, but internally to that school, what is their tracking policy? Who's getting disproportionately disciplined? I mean, those are policy elements. And you might not like that I'm around as much as you would like someone else to be around. But we can actually use some policy and legal mechanisms to say, but you're not going to keep my kid out of the AP class, and you're not going to, suspend them and call the police on, 6-year-olds for disciplinary behaviors. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think it's figuring out, like, which of the things, oftentimes I think when we talk about the gentrification, the moving to opportunity, et cetera, we come back to this question of feeling comfort. And I think I appreciate the way that you're describing it, but so often the people who are proponents of this policy, they describe the deficit as a feeling deficit. Oh, you don't want to move over there because you feel scared, not because you need to be scared because there is actual physical and material harm that can come to you. It's not just a feeling that I might be discriminated against, that I should be counseled through. There are actual discriminatory things happening over there in that space that I might be very rationally trying to avoid. And sort of parsing that out and figuring out which of those we can grapple with from a legal and policy standpoint, I think is really important in our research edifice.
And making sure that policies aren't exacerbating that, right? Exacerbating gentrification, exacerbating displacement, exacerbating people losing their sense of their community, right? It's hard to measure and hard to track, but certainly something we should be striving for. Chris, as a practitioner, how do you use research in your day-to-day work, and what kind of research is most helpful for you?
So that's something that, as we talk about Taylor, I go back to the fact I can give her all of the tools, right? But I have one lever. And so the research and the questions that we're asking now is, how do we create something that's sustainable and self-perpetuating, right? If my lane is mortgage finance, and if I'm trying to unlock this opportunity for her and her family and the next generations that come after her, what are all the things that she needs, right? What can my expectations be around the fact that, some Taylors may say, yeah, thanks for unlocking this equity, and I'm going to buy a new car, or I'm going to go do something that I want to do that has nothing to do with wealth building, right? How do we create the most fertile ground for Taylors to transform their lives permanently? Like, what are the educational pieces? What are the access pieces, right? So what investments does she need to be learning about that she can take advantage of, right? So that she can actually build that wealth. When should she think about stepping up from the home that she's in into the next home? Should she keep this home in perpetuity and use it as a rental property to step up into the next opportunity? How does she prepare herself from those unexpected moments where there's a leak in the roof and it's $500 today or $5,000 a year from now? Those are all the types of things that, as a typical housing person, you're not necessarily talking about, but that's the type of research to build a ecosystem, right, that can perpetuate itself over time. That's super important and something that we're thinking about very deeply, and I think it's an unusual approach for us, in my experience, to be trying to tackle a problem in that way.
It's interesting, we do know from recent research from cash transfer and guaranteed income studies that generally people don't need any additional coaching, counseling, anything like that, that when people feel like they are financially have a moment to breathe, they actually gives them the opportunity to invest more in education and skills and getting a better job, and then people do get better jobs, actually work more, and then that sustains into the long run. So, I think definitely that body of evidence is building up, but hopefully there isn't, giving somebody a chance to have financial stability and housing stability might be plenty on its own. But definitely more research we can do there, for sure. Okay, I'm gonna ask you guys each just a quick closing question, and then we'll turn to audience questions, so get your questions in. Lisa and Haider, what do you think are the key policy implications of your research and action related to equity-oriented policymaking in the housing space? Haider, do you want to go?
Yeah. I think in our case, it's kind of multidimensional. We just, the inclusionary zoning program is one of the program, right? That is, it tries to address affordability by providing, housing below the market rate, right? So that it becomes affordable to someone who has, to that person's income, right? So that's kind of the policy. And I think this policy is interesting because there are some other programs, right, that are, rather than, try to changing the market price of rent, let's say Section 8, right? It tries to help the person, right, to afford that unit. And so I think these are kind of two kind of different dynamics, right? And at the center, at the CHIRP, we are trying to kind of look at all these programs, right? Whether it's Section 8, whether it's the TOPA, whether it's IZ, whether it's HPAP, or whether it's rent control, right? Because all these programs, they give us different dynamics, right? But it seems like the programs that are effective is the ones that really kind of, they try to control the price. I mean, I think IZ would be an effective program, right? It was if it's designed differently. Because we do not know what kind of negotiations are going on between the city and developers, right? When they decide on what type of unit to build, right? Is it going to be 1 bedroom? Is it going to be 1 studio? Or is it going to be 3 bedroom, right? Because, and unfortunately, this is a global issue. A lot of housing equity programs, right, are based on the capitalization of the prices, right? If the place is expensive, there is a lot of capitalization there, and the city you try to share that, right? But why is that place is more expensive? Well, because there's a lot of public investments in it, right? It's close to the subway station. It has better services. Right? All these things are done by the public money, either local or federal money. So I think the equity starts all the way back from there. And there is one other component that we are not discussing is that income, right? I mean, the income has been stagnant for a long time in this country. So for a lot of people, it's just housing is not affordable. And a good example is that, what kind of challenges we have is the HPAP, right? Even if the city helps, I mean, now they increase the help, right? The city provides a mortgage up to $202,000. And it's very popular, but those who are successful gets this funding from the city to go and purchase housing in DC, and they're buying in the neighborhoods that they like, in the Ward 7 and 8, mostly HPAP. But the question is there's not enough funding, and the funding runs out very fast. And the other thing is that they cannot compete with the cash investors. There's a lot of investors that are coming to the city, right? They offer cash to buy the properties. So even if you have a mortgage approved, and you have the extra funding from the city to buy a property, that you can do it. It's just, it takes a long time, like 60 days to close a HPAP deal. But an investor comes to the city with a lot of money and just buys the property. So, and again, we are learning a lot of challenges, right? These are all different aspects. These are all the policies they address the issues from different perspectives. And I think we are learning a lot, right? I mean, but the issue is, I think, it's really it seems like the city has to change this policies, these programs. And some of them might require funding, I mean, to be honest, right? Some of that might require philanthropic or whatever the funding is, what they can find. But it's the way they are designed, right? We find that some of them have potentials, but to increase the impact, right, we need more commitment from the government.
Great, yeah, thanks. Lisa, any closing policy takeaways?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. One, it is absolutely possible and imperative to design policies to address racial harm as directly as possible. Yes, threading the needle of fair housing law, but it is possible to create and design housing policies that squarely address the kinds of racialized harms that have been done by our systems in the past and continue to be done. And I would say that, and we should do that. And the second thing is that, and this comes directly from our work, again, with our community advisory group, is that there also need to be created avenues for the civic and political participation of people who have this experience of economic instability, housing displacement, community, the vibrancy of the community that they hope for, to be able to speak into this space. So for the city to view residents of affordable housing as their constituent, not just the nonprofit developer of the affordable housing. And for people to be able to organize, politically beyond, yes, as tenants and as community members, as neighbors, to be able to bring about some of these broader demands that they have for things like actual land ownership, for business ownership, for wealth creation, that has to go hand in hand. It's probably not a policy activity, but certainly policy organizations, governments can be much more open to and expecting to hear from the residents of affordable housing as citizens.
Great. And in our next panel, I have to give a shout out to the next panel where we have a lead organizer from an amazing tenant organizing group in my city. So I'm excited to hear her speak as well. And we need more voices like that in rooms like this as well. Great. Okay. So I think we have time maybe for 1 or 2 audience questions. Great. Lisa, this question is for you. Could you talk a bit more about the community pressure campaign you mentioned, and why do you think it was successful?
Oh, sure. So, Black Oregon has been campaigning against urban renewal since the 1950s. There have been a number of waves of community uprisings against eminent domain taking and generally the practices. I moved to Portland in 2009 and people were like literally carrying around the Albina Plan, which was the community-based vision of what Northeast Portland should be. That was at that point 10 years old, and they were, like, this is the thing that we wanted. So people have been very active in this space for a long time, but I mentioned to you it's a 6% Black population in an at-wide election city. So it's been difficult to get that political pressure. What happened in 2014 was the last remaining city-owned lot in the URA was put up for sale at pennies on the dollar valuation to be developed as a brand name supermarket chain that I will not bring their fans upon my head by mentioning. And there was it was just kind of a flashpoint moment of people demanding a community benefits agreement on the site, wanting to see a multi-story affordable housing, and that was utterly shut down. And it really erupted. It erupted into a pretty significant political problem for the mayor and the attempt to kind of rebrand urban renewal at the time. And so this new strategy was negotiated out of that. It primarily moves cash into the housing agency for housing production. And I think it remains controversial because it's rental housing was restricted to 60% area median income. Home ownership, which is a much smaller part of the program, is targeted around 80% AMI, but is extremely challenging at that income level. And so people wanted and continue to want more. And I would say that the sort of more that's happening now is, and I would love for folks to look into this, the Albina Vision Trust, which is really directly addressing some of the demolition areas from highway construction and stadium construction. And will be developing some housing, but has a much more comprehensive sense of how to bring the historic community back to its kind of fullest flourishing.
Interesting. And yeah, that probably, I don't know if it's connected at all to the Reconnecting Communities pilot that the federal government has been funding to right-size some of those highways that did tear apart Black communities. Yes. Yep, funded by that. Interesting. Great. I think we're at, we can have one last question. All right, we had a lot of questions in here for you, Lisa. I'll try to ask a broader one. Homeownership as a wealth bidding strategy is problematic in all kinds of ways. Lots of risk dangers of NIMBYism to protect the values of their homes, et cetera. Are you exploring, I guess, Chris, this question is to you. Are you exploring other approaches to wealth building that would address the inequities without those downsides?
I got one lane.
Yeah, that's true. You're at the housing finance.
Right?
I guess, that is your method. Do you think the city as a whole is other? Do you know of any other?
Got my lane.
I
got one lane.
I guess, do either of you have any thoughts on that? Or?
Well, obviously predatory inclusion is a really significant problem. I'll say one thing I'm super proud of is after agitating for quite some time to the city of Portland myself, they have created a strategy around property ownership maintenance in the district for, we were talking about it sort of like Mima's house. It needs a lot of repairs and she does not have a will. And so trying to wrap around not only home repair grants, not loans, but also making sure that there's estate planning and supporting that with really culturally specific estate planning work with attorneys, but also, the kinds of softer touches than legal touches to kind of help people navigate some of their family conversations and make sure that they are prepared to make choices about what they do, whether that is to continue to live in the property or to not get scammed when they sell their property. But that's sort of a new piece that's emerging.
Interesting, yeah.
Well, we have at the church, we have one of our projects that we're doing right now is we're looking at this issue. We are doing like surveys. We partner with Rebuilding Together. It's a national, organization. And because this issue, right, that is, can you build wealth through the housing, right? It's kind of a very, and what do people think, right? So by partnering with this organization, because they have been very successful to fixing homes and they do it freely and they also provide consulting. So a lot of this, cities, right, and states, they have some programs to help people to fix their homes. And they have all kind of issues, right? Bureaucracy or, other kind of quality issues. But it seems like this organization is very successful. And we just send out 2,000 surveys to all these people, and we are the homeowners by partnering with the organization because they trust them. So I think the results are going to be very interesting, and they're going to come because there we should be able to provide answers to some of these questions, right? To what extent repairing homes, right? All these things, right, will help them to pass the wealth to the next generation, and what do they think about that, right? Kind of. Which is, I think, is one of the interesting projects that we are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Be excited to see that. All right, well, if you could all join me in thanking our panelists. I think we'll have a short break after this.
Thank you.